thank you for inviting me today, and also inviting someone who's not only not an accountant, but also probably lives about as far from Europe as Qantas will geographically allow. Also recovering with a little bit of jet lag, but also in a very Australian way, a spider bite. So I didn't bring it with me, the bite, but not the spider. I'd like to just start off with a quick overview of GRI. Some of you are probably quite familiar with GRI and the practices over the years. The GRI standards are really the first set of global principles-based standards designed to help organisations communicate their impacts. And I think it's important to underline that notion about impacts on a broad range of social, economic and broader environmental topics. They are developed and progressed through a multi-stakeholder process, and I sit on the Global Sustainability Standards Board. So GRI now has a dedicated standards board which is independent from the rest of the organisation in that sense. It's certainly modelled on accounting bodies as well. That was through the feedback we got during a consultation process and a review of our governance structures generally. I think it's important to also reference the fact that the GRI standards speak to a variety of audiences. So they're multi-stakeholder in how they are developed, but they're also multi-stakeholder in terms of audiences. So investors, as we've heard this morning as well, investors are one major audience obviously, but we're also speaking to labour, we're also speaking to civil society, we're also speaking to a broader range of communities where companies operate. So investors are one audience, but obviously a very, very important one. And one of the focus areas, and we've contrasted this with frameworks like IRC, CDP and SASB, is that those frameworks look to the impacts on the business, risks is what you're concerned with. In terms of GRI, GRI is looking at impacts of the company, of the business on the broader social and environmental platform. But those things aren't mutually exclusive, and this is where we have more discussion to come. Certainly if we think about something like water as a parameter, when we're looking at water access, water scarcity, water availability in a stressed catchment or a drought-ridden region. When we look at water from that perspective, how much water a company is using for its business is really important to the rest of the users of that catchment, of the water in that catchment, what their future prospects are, how they can access water, how they can use water. But equally, for the company itself, it is a constraining parameter, and it is also a source of risk in terms of water security, water scarcity going forward. So I'd be pains to point out that although the GRI framework looks at impact, these things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and this is part of the discussion we're having today. The GRI standards, this comes after 20 years. GRI had its 20th birthday. GRI has issued 4 iterations of guidelines over the years, and just released those now as standards. So the standards themselves are divided up into modules, and I can talk about this a little bit further when we talk about the core and more piece. But the universal standards are around using a set of principles, which GRI's had for a long time now, general disclosures, management approach, things that lend themselves to talking about strategy, managing different issues, and then also sort of what we call topic-specific standards across environment, social and broader economic development issues. And those standards include qualitative and quantitative disclosures and metrics, and they're also developed and updated independently. So dividing the standards now into modules, we can pluck out a particular module that might be on water, for example, progressively update that and make it more current, more relevant, more useful to a variety of audiences, and then still move progressively through the standards to make sure that's happening across multiple topics. At the moment, for example, if you go to the GRI website, you'll see that there's a new an updated water standard available for comment, and an OH&S safety standard available for comment as well. The standards are generally designed to be used in two ways, sort of flexibly. So you can use the standards in their entirety to do a report in terms of the overall balanced picture of the organisation, but also you can use the various modules and align that with that modular structure. For example, if you wanted to service some of the requirements of the EU directive, you can pluck out some of the standards from the GRI modules across different social and environmental areas and use those. In terms of uptake, we have nearly 4,000 organisations around the world using the GRI framework, and it's also being swept into and referenced in policy instruments around the world too, and stock exchanges. Back in 1997, I think it started with 22 companies using GRI, so in that time we've had a massive amount of growth. But also that referencing is occurring all around the world, and it varies a great deal as well. In some jurisdictions it's just referenced, in other jurisdictions it's mandated, and in some others it's a general, if you're doing a GRI report, we consider you automatically comply with what we're asking for. So that shows the general sort of map of uptake in those instruments. We also align with other frameworks. So GRI, I know we've talked before about a lot of duplication, avoiding duplication. We're certainly involved with the corporate reporting dialogue, but to help streamline and have much more relationship with other frameworks, we do produce linkage documents, so showing how the GSSB and the frameworks align with other existing standards, so like the Carbon Disclosure Project, so we produce those from time to time. We also actively invite people from other standard setting organisations, non-financial reporting organisations to be part of the working groups where we take some of the standards forward. So on the water working group, which I just mentioned, we had representation from CDP, from SASB, and from the CEO Water Mandate on that working group to help progress that alignment. In terms of the core and more approach, I think the modular structure now of the GRI standards lend themselves a lot more to the core and more approach than we have before. So prior to that, we had the G4 guidelines, which were used in their entirety, sometimes slavishly we've heard as box ticking sort of exercises. I think the GRI standards now themselves as modules can be used in a more portable and flexible way. So they could be used to fuel some of the core piece, but also be used to fuel a great deal of the more part of this as well. Okay, thank you.
Good, thank you very much. And
I'll take questions.
The one question I'd have before Ian will share a little on where the corporate reporting dialogue is at and wants to go. I think it's fair to say that traditionally GRI guidelines at the time and now the standards focus much on the impact of a company on the environment rather than the other way around. So when we talk here about integration and the link between non-financial and financial, the question I'd have is GRI, in your view, sufficiently ready with the current standards to also inform financial risk and make that link? Or are there any plans in that direction?
Yes, I think certainly there have been a lot of that work done historically already. So when we think back 20 years ago when GRI was first getting started, we look at what climate change was then, and there was a lot of pushback about even talking about climate change in a reporting or a public reporting context. So you can see now with the evolution of that sort of thinking, that translation from what was seen to be a sort of a rather green sort of peripheral issue even then, has had a trajectory of translating to something quite core in terms of risk now. And I think that's true of a number of issues in terms of things like human rights, when we're looking now at organisations that are trying to translate what does human rights risk mean for a company above and beyond divestment or reputation risk. Other initiatives around things as diverse as animal welfare, where they're looking at livestock practices and the overuse of antibiotics. What does that mean to risk in an agribusiness? So I think GRI progressively updating and involving other standard setters and investors, so we've always had investors at the table, that will help with that sort of experimentation and taking that forward.
Right. And maybe the corporate reporting dialogue has also a role to play. So Ian, the corporate reporting dialogue exists for a number of years, but I think we may need first to be updated a little on where you are and want to go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Wim, and thank you, Accountancy Europe, for inviting me and being brave enough to put two Australians on the stage at the same time. If anybody wants a translation, we'll write it out. So, first of all, it's important to think about the name of the corporate reporting dialogue. So it's a dialogue. Why is it a dialogue? It doesn't have members, it has participants. There's no constitution, there are terms of reference. There's no bank account. There's no strict governance regime. And all this is done for a purpose, because the participants, as we call them, have all been in business for a while. GRI is a prime example. 20 years, developing standards for a multitude of reasons. And we didn't, well, I wasn't involved with the setting up, but the people who set this dialogue up didn't want to be seen to be putting something over the top of these participants. It's something that all the participants can use. So when we're talking about the future of this and call for action, got to keep in mind what is the nature of the corporate reporting dialogue at present. Not to say that it couldn't change, but that's the nature of it right now. It was convened in June 2014 to promote greater coherence, consistency and comparability. I'm sure we all agree with all of those, between corporate reporting frameworks, standards and related requirements. So we're looking to strengthen cooperation, coordination and alignment, which again, everybody's calling for amongst that group, and getting them closer together. What do we want to do? What are our aims? Communicate about the direction, content and ongoing development of frameworks, so a sort of a central point to explain, at least for our participants, what's going on. Find a practical way by which the frameworks can be explained and aligned, notably to avoid potential conflict, inconsistency and duplication, which has already been mentioned. I'll get back to what we're actually doing about that in a minute. Try and clarify and resolve any emerging issues from the activities of the participants and other matters of common interest. Share information, express a common voice, and it includes amongst those to regulators, which is another interesting thing that's come up in the presentation so far. There are 7 participants and 1 observer. The CDP, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, is now an observer for a variety of reasons. The GRI, which we've just heard about, ISB from Hans, Integrated Reporting Council, we've heard about, International Organisation for Standardisation, rather an interesting one, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So those are the members. Some debate on whether we should make it broader. Some people say, I think David Lois said there's 460-something bodies out there making these standards. Should we have 460 participants? General consensus, 8, which we have at the moment, is probably enough to deal with. we should be reaching out to business, we should be reaching out to investors, we should be reaching out to regulators. And so spread our wings that way rather than by having more members. And I can tell you, when you're managing a conference call with 8 participants, it's hard enough. I wouldn't like to have 468. And Vim helps me on that. What have we done so far? We've done a landscape map setting out the links between all the various reporting initiatives. And we've put out a statement of common principles of materiality, and which compares materiality definitions and approaches by the CRD participants. Only 2 outputs in 2 years, 3 years. Doesn't seem a lot, but there's been a lot of discussion on what we should do and how we should frame it and how the participants should work together. As I say, keep remembering, these are some of them long-standing, quite large organisations with an excellent history. Hans mentioned that CDP has got more staff than the ISP. I think it's got 190 staff. It's a big organisation. GRIs as well. But what have we got on the current agenda? I think the most exciting agenda item is a project to align participants' metrics across all the reporting frameworks and to maintain that alignment. You've got to be careful when you say align, because as Hans and I know, working with FASB for 6 years and the ISB before that, getting total alignment to really independent boards who've got long histories is really, really difficult. But you should go as far as you can. You should push it as far as you can. We were looking at a response and further action on the FSB task force on climate-related financial disclosures. And we are hoping, and this is just all in the conjecture at this moment, but we're hoping to get some funding and to make those projects really serious. And there's a chance, I think, that we will. We're looking at a paper on understanding the role of transparency and accountability. And we're looking at a paper on a common foundation, exploring whether we can find a common foundation that participants can collectively champion. So that's where we've been, that's where we're heading, that's what we are at this stage. What do we have going forward? Well, if we go back to the Bob Dylan examples, we're either knocking on heaven's door or a hard rain's going to fall.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think there's only one key question in this session, and that is all about the call to action that we had this morning. The non-financial information standards should converge and work together, and maybe even get to one global framework. As you can imagine, would like to have both your views on that. Ian, you from your experience in the CRD, and Robyn, well, maybe GRI is the one where it all should come together.
Do you want to go first?
Who first?
Oh, no, you go first.
Well, I guess ideally, if you had an ideal world and you wanted to knock on heaven's door, you would come to the point where at least the 8 participants or 7.5 participants of CRD do agree that there is advantage for all of them in getting together. But you do have to remember, to do that, they'd have to cede a lot of their current powers. I mean, maybe they'd join in the certainly they'd join in the ongoing effort. They'd have to be selling hard to their members and supporters that this is a better way forward than the way they've been going up to date. We'd have to be certain that you can, and I think this first project we're about to begin will show us whether we can get those groups together or not. And I think there's a good chance, sort of 70%, 80% alignment. I don't think you'll get 100%. So let's have a go at that and see how everybody plays together and then work out whether we can take steps forward, which would mean either handing it over to somebody, maybe the ISB, maybe the Integrated Reporting Council or whoever, or formalising the corporate reporting dialogue more and taking forward a united one. But maybe in 2 years, if we do this alignment project well, we might have a real feel of whether that's achievable.
All looking at you, Robyn.
I mean, GRI is definitely, we're participating in the corporate reporting dialogue and definitely interested in progressing the alignment discussions, and that's one of the reasons with the updates of and the progressive rollout of updates of the separate modularised standards. They're actively involving the other organisations like SASB and CDP and reaching out to bring them into that process as a working group, and also make that process quite transparent for people to provide some feedback on. So I think to some extent that's in that maturity that's already happening, but certainly participating. If Ian's sort of running the collective sort of sandpit for the reporting kindergarten, that we all get along and play nice. And
See who tosses out the toys.
yes, share our toys nicely and come up with a good one.
Agree with the call to action?
Oh, yeah.
Would you?
Yes, and I think the flexibility that's starting to appear in standards like GRI lend themselves to that. No, everybody wants to see more concise reporting. You ask people, what do you want to know less of? No one actually tells you that. We want more information, but we want it to be more concise. So I think definitely the way the GRI standard has been reconfigured lends itself to that approach as well, and allows that flexibility. I'm also really attracted to the notion of safe place for bumblebees to fly and experiment as well. If we provide that space, I think that's where a lot of the great work has occurred in terms of translating from one stakeholder group to the investor lens, issues and the maturity in how those things translate.
Right. And would you see a role for your organisation there if it is about such a reporting lab?
Yes, definitely. I think that's where we learn a lot about what's useful, what's not useful, how to experiment in a safe environment, learn a lot from that. I think we've seen a lot of experimentation in reporting organically anyway, and a strong herding instinct amongst sectors in particular, where they pick up on each other's styles of reporting or information that's being disclosed. They build on it and experiment with that even further. So certainly in terms of GRI being a multi-stakeholder piece, I think helps that too, because when you're talking to perhaps workers or suppliers to a particular company, they may have some burning issues that sort of take time to evolve, translating that they can eventually translate into risk and into financial lenses. And we did have a session with some ESG analysts at the GRI conference a few years ago, where one said that they really don't like the use of the term non-financial, mostly because they think most of these issues do have a financial impact. We just haven't actually translated them into that language yet.
Exactly.
Or felt that. Yeah. So we do need safe places and experimentation, definitely.
Right.
And I think your point about who are you setting these standards for is very important, because if we're going to try and get this together, the first thing we have to sort out is whether it's just investors or whether it's society. And I don't have an easy answer to that. And maybe there's a halfway house, but it needs to be sorted out before you could move forward.
Yeah. And well, as you said in your introduction, the corporate reporting dialogue currently, you said, even doesn't have a bank account, let apart, governance, anything that resembles good governance.
No.
So in that regard,
it's got a bad chairman.
in that regard, you could argue that the corporate reporting dialogue is expectedly not the place to converge standards as a body.
Not unless it was reconstituted. No.
Right. No. Would you plea for that? Would you think that would be a good idea? Is that the first step we should take to move on the midterm to further standardization, or should we resolve it with the parties we have?
I think step by step, the rolling stone that.
First the bank account.
First the bank account.
And a salary for me. If we could sort that out, the rest would come quickly.
Let's start with the bank account. Yeah.
But I mean, I think I'm really hopeful, and I know I think you are too, that we can get this alignment project underway and hopefully get some relatively quick results. Things are never very quick in standard setting, but and that will tell us whether there's the will and desire for this to be done. And then I think you have to have a debate about where's best to centre it. You know, in the meantime, if we just keep doing our work, I think we add to the whole picture.
Right. You might have questions to the corporate reporting dialogue or to GRI. This will be your chance in 1 minute, so just be prepared for that. As I think there's one question I'd like to ask to both of you, and that relates to the integration that we're also discussing the full day, the integration between non-financial and financial. And the question that I have for quite some time is, are we going sufficiently far? If you look at the CRD, all standard setters are presented, all the 8 major ones. But are we really integrating is the question I have, or should we take much further steps than we're currently doing? And maybe for you, Robyn, as well, GRI focusing on the non-financial, and you told us about, you know, the investors being involved, etc. But it might be slightly different from connecting, for example, with a financial reporting framework. What are your views on that?
I think CRD was deliberately set up with financial and non-financial standard setters with that goal in mind. Again, sort of one step at a time. Let's see if we can get some common ground on the non-financial. But ISPER will be there. They'll be involved in the debates. They'll be chiming in. Hans has already indicated that maybe some of this, and so has Robyn, maybe some of this non-financial information is actually financial information anyway, you know, and maybe the distinctions not as important as we think it is. So I think if we, without making a big fuss about pulling the two together, I think it will naturally happen.
Are you have the same view?
Yes, I think it's sort of hastening slowly in that sense, that we still need to be careful to allow for some experimentation and innovation to occur in one space, and then looking at where there is clear alignment and clear overlap of intent. That's where we can integrate and agree on those things. And in that sense, the non-financial reporting is still quite young. I mean, GRI itself is 20 years old, but that's compared to financial reporting, it's still a bit of a juvenile delinquent in some ways, non-financial reporting. So that needs to be allowed to be perhaps have an awkward phase, an ugly phase before it sort of grows up. And then can adopt that sort of level of integration. So I think it's ready in a lot of ways, but we still need to allow that level of experimentation to occur and have a place for that to happen.
I'll come back to that experimentation.
You're going back to that again. I keep bringing that up.
Let's see whether there are questions from anyone in the audience. None. There's one in the back. If you can use the microphone under your left cover of your seat and then push the button that says press here to talk, I think it is.
In which language?
Hello, do you hear me?
In English.
Hi, I'm Julia Linares from WWF. I wanted to ask Mr. Mackintosh, referred to the TCFD recommendations, and I wanted to ask if they think they should be integrated in the NFRD review, hopefully next year. Thank you.
Which review is that?
The non-financial reporting directive.
The directive. Well, that's really up to Europe as a policy matter. We're going to, if we get this alignment project underway, the TCFD recommendations will be an initial and quite large part of the first 6 or 9 months of the project. And if we could do that, and if we can get our participants to see how they can be integrated or should be integrated into their standards, then I don't see why Europe couldn't integrate them into the directive.
Any other on the right, from my side at least? I don't have a mic. Oh, you don't? On your other side? It's just for everyone else to hear it in the room. There we are.
He's found one.
There we go.
There we go. Please.
Andy Mason from Aberdeen Standard Investments. I was just a question to the GRI. If you've had any approaches around passive investment and how they could use your information through algorithms, etc.
Passive investment.
And how they could use...
So how they could use GRI data and feed it into an algorithm to run a passive type screen with your information?
Have we? I think in terms of the data, the broader data program that GRI was looking at over the past few years, the GRI, the Standards Board, which I concern myself with, is mostly on the promulgation of the standards. So the board itself is now in a process of looking at that sort of work, and to what extent they're engaging with data in that regard. I think there was previously a fair bit more work occurring, and we did have a discussion before about the technology questions that come with the core and more piece. But at the moment, the GRI board is sort of examining that a bit more closely. So I don't have a definitive answer for you at the moment, sorry.
We're moving to a quick break, the afternoon break, but there's one final question that actually links a bit the previous session and the conversation we're having about this experimentation. And I think in the previous session it was said by all panelists, yes, we would like that, and just do it, as it was said in that session. I think you both also said, yeah, that would be welcomed. I assume with that if such a reporting lab or initiative would be started, you would be willing to, well, join or at least have a conversation about what it could be. But a question I'd have just before the break is whether you would have any party, if you like, in any institution that you would encourage to take the initiative there. Would it be yourself? Would it be the CRD? Would it be another standard setter, or is it the policy authority, or is it Accountancy Europe? I'm just throwing out a few ideas.
Well, the financial reporting laboratories that the UK has, for example, and which you're talking about having in Europe as well, I think are really a good place for experimentation. And while I wouldn't think, well, I don't know, the members of the Corporate Reporting Dialogue might like to join in, but I would have thought we'd be very interested in what's going on and an active observer, at least.
Yes. I think it would be an umbrella that either has everybody equally sort of involved, or be completely neutral, be another a group altogether, perhaps from that public policy perspective, but something that can facilitate that discussion, that ownership of the various groups involved. So either equally in terms of a partnership kind of approach, or a neutral space.
Can I make one more musical one?
Go ahead.
One of the
Which
best
singer?
I'll tell you in a minute. One of the best moments at the ISP when I was there, we had a particularly fractious debate, and one of the members said, "Remember what the Beatles said, we can work it out." And I said, "Yeah, but do you know the name of that song? Try to see it my way."
Thank you very much, thank our panelists.